Hello, are you there? It's me, your favorite AP US history teacher, Mr. Hollenbach. It's good to see you all here. So as promised, I will be jumping through the actual fighting of the First World War, the Great War, on Zoom, because a lot of the fighting is not done by the US and it just eats up a lot of time. And while we're on schedule, I want to keep it that way. So the easiest way is to not get bogged down in another messy affair, as Washington would call it, in the world, like a world war. So I'll walk you through it from where we left off in class today. I'm more concerned with our class time being geared towards post-World War I, how Woodrow Wilson tries to build back the world after a catastrophe like this. So without further ado, pull out your EQs and we'll jump in. I promise not to do the little creepy voice again, unless you make me. So don't make me angry. I have that in my back pocket. Here we go. I believe you guys are on number 2 because we did A, B, and C of number 1, how the alliance system pulled the world into war. But number 2 says, explain the concepts behind the Schlieffen Plan and its outcome. I love the word Schlieffen. It's actually the name of a German officer who came up with it, but it sounds like a curse word. Like you could easily work Schlieffen into your vocabulary when you get angry and it would work. Like, oh, Schlieffen, I just banged the heck out of my toe. That sort of thing really works. Anyway, the Schlieffen Plan is pretty simple. Germany was trying to find the quickest way forward once they were involved in the war to basically begin to beat on the French and the British. And they don't see any way to do that quickly unless they absolutely knock out the French very, very quickly by invading the Western Front first. So by invading into France and sweeping it up quickly, they can then turn their concentration towards the East and Russia, which they vowed to go after because they were protecting Serbia. So this is the physical layout of what the Schlieffen Plan looks like. As you can see, Germany is like a swinging gate. Its troops are going to go through Holland and Belgium and Luxembourg and then sweep in behind the French fortress towns. That border, let me get the cursor on it right here. This is the German and French border running right here, is in the Black Forest part of Central Europe. This is a portion of Europe that the French anticipated the Germans would invade through. So Schlieffen, using their anticipations against them, decides to march through these sovereign nations. And he sends word ahead and he says, look, we're not looking to take over Holland, Luxembourg, Belgium. We're just looking to pass through so we can sweep in and take out the British or the French quickly. Holland and Luxembourg, countries that effectively don't have armies, couldn't do anything about it. And to be truthful, Belgium doesn't really have an army either. The Germans are marching almost 500,000 soldiers through, and Belgium only has an army of 10,000. But the proud king of Belgium refuses to allow them to peacefully invade his country and puts up a fight. That fight is enough time and enough delay on the Schlieffen Plan that this French fortress swings as they're fighting in Belgium to meet them in these farm fields here. So instead of the Germans being able to sweep behind, take Paris, and then go fight, they're actually both sides converging and crashing into this space to fight. And this is what's going to get it bogged down into a very nasty trench warfare setup. All right, so moving forward, that flipped. Number 3 says, identify the Battle of the Marne and analyze its impact on fighting. Well, the first Battle of the Marne is a stalemate where literally both sides realized they were in over their heads. The fighting was way too violent for what they had prepared. And they dig trenches in order to defend their positions and hide from enemy fire. The impact is very clear. This takes place in August, but only 3 months later, trenches start stretching the entirety of the French countryside. All of Western Europe is becoming a battle line. And this becomes known as the Western Front. So its impact on the fighting, pretty simple. It became clear that you couldn't advance the lines of war as easily or readily as you had in the past, and that stalemates were going to be the order of the day as people dug trenches and tried to bunker in where they were. Letter A, identify trench warfare and explain its impact on the war. Trench warfare, you guys learned a ton about. And again, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this stuff, but It's the idea that you had a small dugout space amid all the fighting where you could hide, where you could launch raids called going over the top. And, oftentimes in some of the most tense places, the distance between, oh, I'm not sorry, the distance between a Central Powers bunker or trench and an Allied power bunker or trench was, 100 feet. But that 100 feet of no man's land, think about it for a second. If I go over the top and the boys yell charge and we all go running out, that's all well and good. In an old style of warfare, if 50 guys went running at a guy with a repeating rifle, 10 maybe get shot, but the other 40 advance. Now, in 1914, sending 50 guys over the top against a Gatling gun, a machine gun, means that all but like 5 are going to die, and it's not even a question. So the tactics of the time are the issue here. Trenches were the easiest and quickest way for troops to not lose ground, but also learn how to avoid the terrible, terrible nature of war in World War I. Getting caught in no man's land was basically an order to be shot down. So oftentimes it just meant no advances and everybody was locked in stalemate. Here's some pictures of what I'm talking about. This would be a backline trench. Like, you're still on the fronts, but you're a couple of trenches back, and they would weave them almost in a shape like this. You can see my cursor. Ooh, ooh. Like long, wide S's. And that way there were deeper trenches where you could retreat to and take a nap, cook a meal. You'd still have people on watch. But then there were also these kinds of trenches that were nearer to the front lines, where they're less shallow, or they're less deep, they're much more shallow. You put your gunners in them to clear out anybody going over no man's land. It becomes a much different type of style of fighting with these. All right, and then this is a good, accurate look at what no man's land was like. People would try to put up barbed wire fences if they could, or obstructions, make it extremely difficult for someone to run across, because the more they have to labor to get across that land to advance on you, the easier chance you have of getting a shot on them. Okay, so number 4 says explain and identify the importance of new weapons involved in World War I. And we talked about this in class today. This is the first war where the technology is far outpacing the soldiers and the strategists' ability to cope with their new technologies. I mean, again, I think that is amazing, truly an astounding fact that by 1917, they're only just arriving at the idea that planes can be used as weapons of war, not just as tools of reconnaissance. That should really kind of let you in on how far the technology had moved and how much mentalities of war had lagged behind. So the Industrial Revolution delivers all these things that we've already talked about: steel and oil, and the idea of flight, machinery, assembly lines. All these things are great, but the question is asking us the importance of new weapons. What is it? Well, look at some of the things we're talking about. Specifically, poisonous gas is like the most horrifying. When trenches start getting dug, that's when chemical weapons come into play hard. It was the easiest way to get a trench clear. So if you knew that they were in front of you and that they were just bunkering, and you had no way to get them out, but you had a mustard gas bomb, or you had a grenade of chlorine, you could easily get people up and shootable as they tried to avoid the gas. A lot of people see this as a war crime now. Tanks existed during this time, but if we're being honest, tanks were moving at 1 to 2 miles an hour at basically no speed whatsoever, and were bullet magnets and not reinforced well enough to stop most bullets. So they're largely ineffective. And the same kind of goes for airplanes to the latter half of the war. People using it for recon, that's all well and good. But ultimately, I mean, knowing where your enemy is different from, actually doing something to them. All right, that moves us to 5. And I told you, I'm going quick on all the material stuff about the war, because at this point, you're not going to get really tested over the philosophies of World War I. It's more about what comes out of it. But this is a philosophy that keeps America out of it, right? So looking at number 5, using the political cartoon, identify why the US attempts to stay out of World War I. Hit pause right here and take a second and answer that. See if you can interpret this political cartoon. I actually made reference to it in class today. Hit pause, answer that question, number 5. Okay, so as you might have guessed, or even if you didn't, what we have here is a suggestion, right? That the thing keeping the American back from looking into and involving itself with a world on fire over in Europe is a wall. And that wall has a name called the Monroe Doctrine. The Great Wall is the name of the cartoon. So there's a clear understanding between the artist and the subjects or the readers that we have a policy in place that is pretty ironclad, because I guess brickclad's a better way to go out here, but we have a policy in place that basically says, look, if the world wants to set itself on fire and go after each other, that's its business. Over here in America, it's business as usual. We have no desire to involve ourselves in the embers of war. So we're just going to look on sitting pretty from over here and avoid it as long as we can. Okay, so I would say the political cartoon is identifying that the US really doesn't have a dog in the fight, doesn't really see it as a mentality of this is our war. All right, so 6, use a T-chart to list potential reasons for US involvement on each side. Well, you know, I showed this in class a little earlier today, and I would say, you know, which side should the US pick? There's reasons for both of them. We have about 120 million people in America around that time, and 11 million of them are German American. In addition to the fact that Irish Americans are a massive population, and they absolutely hate the British, like despise them. But on the other side, the Allies are much more our cultural allies. They're the type of people who believe and think like we do as we ask them to. I don't know if there's a right or wrong answer here. I do know that these are not the German Nazis that everybody pretends that they are sometimes. World War I Germans were just simply that. They were German, and when they're defeated, their pride is, you know, knocked down, and that's why Hitler's rise becomes so big. But these Germans are very sympathetic to a lot of Americans, and vice versa. But just as closely allied is the British government with our federal government, as you can see by the exports that we're shipping to Great Britain during this time. It makes sense who they end up choosing. And I'd like you to look at it and tell me, what is it about the situation that makes it so simple when the time comes for the US to pick a side? Take a second and answer that. Okay, so for me, it's that stat that I pointed out in class today about the 1916 exports in terms of cash. If I'm shipping 1.5 billion plus monies to a country, there's zero chance in heck I'm going to just decide to ally against them unless they do something deeply, deeply harmful to my own people. All right, that leads us into the next one, number 7. Explain the purpose of Britain's blockade system and Germany's policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. I don't remember, I always forget which classes I do it with. It's a problem with teaching 3 preps. But, you know, I introduced this idea, and I'm going to bring it up in class tomorrow. So if I didn't talk about it and you didn't watch, it's not that big of a deal. I'll talk about it. But I've introduced the idea to other classes for sure, and maybe you guys too, of something called stair troll. Right, stair troll exists in the you know, the stairwell that is right next to the auditorium, and let's imagine a scenario for a second. Stair troll exists in a space that is common space. That entire stairwell is for all of Madison Southern students, faculty, and staff to use to go up and down. But let's say for whatever reason, on your freshman year, you're walking up the stairs in the middle of 3rd period, like let's say a week into school. And all of a sudden, you know, a dimensional portal opens right there before your very eyes, and out pops this huge, hulking, 8.5-foot, furry and stinking hot breath monster. And you look at him and you go, "You're not scared because you're a baller. Let's be real." You go, "Who are you?" And he goes, "Well, I'm Stair Troll." And you go, "Okay." And you go, and he says, "No, no, no, not okay. These are my stairs." And you look at him and you're like, "Bro, are you serious? I'm just going back to Laquetta's class. Like, I'm just using the stairs. Not a big deal." He goes, "No, these are my stairs, and I'm gonna let you pass this time. But let me let you know something real quick. If I ever, like, I get sense of like Dale and Step Brothers on this, don't ever touch my drum set. If I catch you ever on these stairs again, I'm gonna pop out of my interdimensional portal. I'm gonna pop you right in the nose. I'm gonna hit you as hard as I can." You're like, "Okay, that's kind of weird and super controlling, but yeah, whatever, bro." And Stair Troll opens his portal and he leaves. Well, you're freaked out about it. You just saw an interdimensional being. You go to a psychiatrist, they clear you. So you can accurately ascertain that this really happened. That was real. And so the rest of your freshman year, you don't use those stairs. You're late to class because you're using the other 2 sets of stairs instead. Sophomore year, same thing. It's still fresh in your mind. It's annoying, but you're there. And by your junior year around Christmas, you're like, I've seen thousands of people at this point use those stairs. Haven't seen Stair Troll once. I'm really late for class. And if I get another tardy in this one, I'm going to be in huge trouble. And so you decide, all right, I'm going to use those stairs just once. And as you hit the landing at the middle of the stairs, here comes that interdimensional portal. It opens up and out pops Stair Troll. And in one swift motion, he swings at you. And as he's swinging, he yells, "Gotcha, sucker!" Catches you right in the nose, busts up your nose. You're bleeding. It's broken. All right. So all that story sets up this question. Okay. Who's at fault? Who's at fault for your broken nose? Is it Stair Troll for punching you? Or is it you for knowing the consequence of your action would be a punch and ignoring it? Who's at fault? All right, so as you answer, when you think about it, I think the wise answer here is a little bit of both. He has no right to hit you in a public space for using a public space. He doesn't own it. But at the same time, whether he has a right or not is almost irrelevant because you were fully aware, made fully aware of the consequence of this action, yet you chose it anyway, willingly. What that leads us to believe is that you have some agency in the determination of what happens to you in this moment. So all that said, here's why that's relevant. The Stair Troll is Germany in this scenario. Britain is stopping all German ships from going to America. As a result, Germany announces a submarine war around Britain. Stair Troll in this situation is the cutting edge technology the Germans have in the German U-boat, basically like a submarine. All the other navies, all the other countries don't have this level of quality of technology, but the Germans do. And so there's a real threat. These U-boats can operate underwater. And as a result, they're very difficult to know where they are or who they're patrolling. And the blockade begins in 1915, right? And this is the Stair Troll ultimatum that Germany begins. Yes, they're blockading British people, but they're also telling Americans where they can and cannot go. They're warning Americans, stay off British ships because they could and they would sink them if they have their way to do it. All right. Now, let's talk about that for a second. All right. So when you think about it, that letter A, identify the reasoning of German warning to US citizens on travel. I would say that this is a de-escalation by the German military, that they're actively avoiding trying to start a war with the US jumping in. It would be very similar to what we're seeing in Ukraine today. If the Russians told us, hey, we're going to control all Ukrainian airways, so staying out of Ukrainian airspace is a very good idea for you because we can't guarantee that you'll be safe. We're trying to do something here. That's the same mentality Germany's saying, like, don't get involved in the unrestricted submarine warfare because if you put people on British ships, we might sink them and you'll get angry. Or if you send your own ships in to help, then we'll get angry and we'll look to fight you. right, so that leads us into describe the importance, number B, or letter B. Describe the importance of the Lusitania and explain its untold story. Well, it's a sad one for sure, but let's look at it. All right, so in 1915, the Lusitania is torpedoed by a German U-boat, and it sinks with over 1,200 passengers dying as a result. They become completely and utterly dead at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. 128 of the people on that boat were Americans. All right. Now, again, a stair troll moment, right? This is the North Atlantic. These are international waters. Just like the back stairwell is not stair trolls territory, and the North Atlantic is not the Germans, the question still remains, do you blame stair troll, aka the Germans, for this action, or do you blame these, the Lusitania was a British ship, these British officers and passengers and a few Americans for defying the work of the naval power of Germany, that they're just going out and doing it. I don't know where this is. Who's to blame? Well, regardless of who's to blame, what comes of it is pretty tragic. There are huge peace negotiation talks done between the US and Germans. And ultimately, Germany promises not to do it again without consulting the vessel of their plan first. But then the untold story comes in. If you answer that the Germans are killing civilians, that's on them in this question. I want you to consider this. It's eventually found out that the Lusitania on a passenger ship, right? This is a passenger ship, was actually carrying 4,200 cases of ammunition for the British. And so my question becomes, okay, so the Germans did it, but they did it in such a way that they did give a warning that if you come in here, this will happen. And they followed through. The next thing that I have to ask is, are the Americans somehow complicit or to blame because they intentionally chose to put passengers at risk by putting weapons of war, cases of ammunition on a passenger cruiser? And, I'll be real, I don't really know the answer to that one. It's an extremely difficult question to try to overcome. All right, but anyway, that moves us on. We'll keep moving from there. All right, so letter C, analyze the German response to US criticism and explain why Germany again implements the stair troll idea of unrestricted submarine warfare. So the US is enraged, and I always ask kids at this point, do you think the sinking of the Lusitania is enough to declare war on a place like Germany? And 9 times out of 10, the kids are like, it's tragic, it's bad. I could definitely understand or justify a war, but it's not the right time to do it. As a result, Germany agrees not to sink passenger ships without future warning. However, they're going to continue their unlimited submarine warfare. That's a big part of this, okay? They're going to continue it. Take a second and see if you can figure out why. Like, how are these guys going to get away with continuing it? Explain that. All right, so the reason why they're going to continue it is because it's effective, right? If they don't continue doing it, they can't actually block off the British, which is the whole point. They have to cut the supply lines of the British. But that takes us into a whole mess, a whole new can of worms. Number 8, explain the purpose and impact of the Zimmerman note. So the US is handed a note from British intelligence. That's what we mean by intercepted. In that note, it claims that the Germans are speaking to the Mexicans on back channels, that they're having a discussion. And this Zimmerman note, as it becomes known, is declared to be this like mutual agreement between Mexico and Germany. And the basic promise is that if the Mexicans will attack the US and get them involved on the southern border, in return for that, that Germany will come over and it will help them liberate Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. And so the Mexican Empire begins to grow again as they get back a substantial portion of land they lost in the Mexican-American War. All right, so that is enough for us to get involved in the war, right? The impact there is we jump into the war at this moment. Now, here's the thing that I always pause at. And I ask myself this question in most historical settings, and the answers aren't always comfortable. And I don't know if they're supposed to be, but I want to ask you. There are 4 players in the Zimmermann note. The British who intercept the note, the US who received the note from the British, and then the Germans and the Mexicans. All right, 4 players. Here's a great question historically to ask yourself when you're involving yourself in history. Who stands to benefit the most from a specific action or event? The most, that's an important part of this. I can make the argument that all 4 stand to benefit. However, only one can benefit the most. I want you to think about it. Based on the way it was written, the way Woodrow Wilson and everybody, kind of interpret it when they got their hands on it. Who gains the most from this Zimmermann note coming to light? All right, so for me, here are the gains, and I'm going to put them in order of least beneficial to most. For me, Britain might on the surface gain nothing, and that's important to think. The Americans definitely gain very little. Going to war is actually a loss in most places. The Mexicans are in a little border skirmish with the US, but it's like, squabbling groups of like 20 some bandits. It's not huge. So they technically, if they do this, they have the chance to gain land, but they're also in a good place with the US. They're not agitating the US. And so it's pretty much a happy place. The Germans gain a ton because it begins to involve the US, but keep them on their side. For me, I always circle back to the British. When you're fighting an enemy who is blockading you, one of the easiest and best ways to begin to break the blockade is to involve another ally who is bigger, stronger, and more well-equipped, which America was all 3. As a result, the British basically gained an ally who's willing to go to war at the drop of a hat if and when the Germans decide to break that contract of the free and open seas once again. It's a little conspiratorial to say the British stood the most and therefore leaked this, but it also isn't outlandish. Remember, they're the ones who intercepted the message. They're the ones who passed it on to the Americans. And you have to ask yourself, are the Germans stupid? Are the Mexicans stupid? Do you really think that there are foreign dignitaries talking on main channels that can be intercepted about secret alliances that are meant to start wars with America? I find that harder to believe than the alternative, which is Britain claimed they got it and handed it to the British Prime Minister. But I don't know, and I might never. All right, so anyway, as a result of the Zimmermann note, war is declared by the United States. During this war, we're going to see a lot of craziness pop off. All right, number 9. On May 18th, 1917, we passed what's known as the Selective Service Act, requiring men 21 to 30 to register for a draft. This is pretty normal, pretty standard process these days that you fill out a selective service card. Back then, this was kind of new and fresh. So the idea of going to war was exciting for a lot of these men. And then the early issues the Army faced are pretty interesting. It's fun. They are having such a high amount of new recruits and new signups that their supply chain actually can't equip all the new soldiers as quickly as they're needing to go out. So oftentimes what you would see is that soldiers would be practicing shooting drills or gun discipline, and they wouldn't even have an actual projectile weapon. They would have, a stick or something like it to simulate the effect. All right, now, letter A, explain the journey of US troops to Europe and describe what they did upon arrival. So this is an interesting one. I always enjoy this. They get over there. The journey for troops is one of a convoy system. Basically, the big fear that the general at the time, John Pershing, has is we have these unrestricted submarine war boats, U-boats essentially. And if any one of them gets disrepaired or taken apart, then literally moving America away from Russia is going to be almost impossible. You just can't do it. And so what we end up seeing is you've got to get a mentality of these troops safely through this area. But you can't do it with these U-boats lurking around and ready to sink them all. So a convoy system would work where there would be a transport boat in the very middle, and then you would surround them with warships that had less men on them. Those destroyers and those cruisers would encircle them. If they saw anything in the water, they would form a defensive, phalanx around the one that was carrying the soldiers. Now, here's the part where I need you to weigh in. Once they get to Europe, once they get to Britain, the British and the French are begging the Americans to immediately jump into war. But here's the thing. Pershing won't allow the American soldiers to jump directly into war. He wants them to train on European terrain by themselves. When they take leave at the end of a training day, they're not to fraternize with the British or the French soldiers. They literally are to basically keep to themselves, even in this foreign country. I want you to tell me, why is Pershing, the general of this little expeditionary force, why is he so insistent that the American soldiers not fraternize and hang out with the British and the French soldiers? I want you to take a second and answer that. All right, so I don't know what you said, but here's what I believe it to be, and I've read a few sources to back this up. The idea of entering the war in 1917 with all the death and desolation of World War I, the last thing that Pershing wanted his men to do was go sit with these rugged veterans of the war and immediately watch his men's motivation go out of them as they realize how dangerous this is. They hear stories from these British and these French soldiers about how miserable life is fighting. So the act of keeping them secluded was actually an act of keeping their morale up for the fight to come. All right, next. Identify and explain the impact of issues in Russia and describe German success. So right as we're entering the war, you're also seeing the Russians leave the war. What happens is something I alluded to in class today. The rise of the Communist Party is something that the Russians are dealing with. And what ends up happening one night in 1917 is the Bolsheviks, a group of working class individuals on the back of Karl Marx and his Communist Manifesto, are seeking an equal distribution of wealth and trying to do away with private ownership of the resources in their community, in their country. They're led by a man named Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, who basically decides two things. One, we got to kill the Romanov family and the bloodline. So not only does the king, the czar, die, but so do his wife and his 4 children. And then the second thing he wants to do is he's sick of sending Russia's brothers, Russia's children, out to the war front to die on behalf of the wealthy elite class of the Germans or the wealthy elite class of the British. He basically, Lenin says, why should I send poor men to die in a rich man's war? Let the rich fight. Let the rich eat themselves. And he backs out. He just signs a peace treaty, says, I'm out. I'm not fighting for any side. It's over. This is huge because now that two-front war that Germany was worried about is essentially gone. Germany is free to focus on the West. They don't have two on they don't have an Eastern Front or a Western Front. They just have the Western Front now. And as a result, Germany's extra men are able to surge a little bit forward, and they get the Allies pushed back to the Marne River at one point. All right, so now U.S. involvement. Describe, this is letter A, describe the impact U.S. involvement begins to have on the war. I mentioned this in class that, the Americans, I think it's a foregone conclusion, even with the German offensive being successful, I think the British and the French still win this one. But having the Americans there makes it a lot less fighting. So when the Americans begin fighting, nearly 12 months after arriving, like we're talking, they sit around for almost a year, just digging trenches and being ready. It was the sort of thing where when they fight, they're able to successfully defend Paris in 1918. They go into northern France and they begin to capture the forested regions. And one of the other big things is that like they're quite literally digging around and encircling with these trenches. It's kind of a smart move. The US spends over a year just digging trenches, not really actually fighting, to give themselves the positional advantage to surround their enemy. And knowing that the German government has nowhere to run because they basically ruined all their relational value with the world. Germany is only a matter of days away from surrendering by November. All right, so yeah, and the biggest win is probably the salvation of Paris, where they saved Paris from the oncoming German army. Letter B, explain the impact the Second Battle of the Marne had. The Second Battle of the Marne is considered to be the bloodiest day of World War I. Look at this, 150,000 casualties on August 3rd. It's the last great offensive. It's the last hurrah for the German army. It's their last big push to win World War I. And it fails, right? The Allies begin counterattacking in September and pushing them all the way back to Germany. It's an overwhelming defeat and kind of egg on the face of the German army. All right, so identify the term armistice and how World War I starts to end. By November 11th, the German economy is so crippled from the war effort that the people are striking for food, they're beginning to riot, and revolution is sweeping through their allies' countries. As a result of not having the goods to continue war, the Central Powers just kind of surrenders, which puts them at full mercy of the terms of the victors. It's both good and bad. If you have a victorious or justifiably good person in leadership, then it doesn't matter if you win or lose, they'll look out for you. But in this scenario, if you have the British and the French who are the winners who get to determine the outcomes, it's going to get pretty petty pretty quick, okay? And so the Allies are beginning to demand pretty wild things, like Germany not only surrender all its weapons, but that they actually demilitarize their entire culture in that area. Kind of wild. All right, so 11, explain the purpose of the US propaganda poster. I don't really want to spend that much time on it, but I think it's pretty obvious. Read it with me. You can answer that question there. How do you think this poster helped to convince American people that war was a good idea? You have this woman in a sailor's outfit saying, gee, I wish I were a man, I'd join the Navy. And then the caption below, be a man and do it. Yeah, sounds like a really quality gender neutral, gender equal approach to armed military service. Anyway, take a second with that. Tell me what you think it's trying to convince the American people about. So obviously they're playing on gender stereotypes that, if you're a man, you would serve in the military because this chick is willing to, so why aren't you? All right, now, two things at the end of the war. America enters the peace negotiations at the Treaty of Versailles with two end goals. They want World War I, the Great War, to be the war to end all wars, to which I say LOL, right? The second thing they want to grab from this entire thing is they're trying to make a safer world where democracy is openly discussed and given time of day. Because all these people complain about their qualities of lives, but they live in oligarchies or monarchies or totalitarian regimes around the world. And Wilson sees winning World War I as a great chance to spread and advance his moral diplomacy, his idea that democracy does in fact belong to all peoples. All right, so these two goals, take a second and evaluate them. Are they a good jumping off place? And tell me what you think is going on with it. Did I skip a page? I might have. No. No, we're good. Man, that was out of order though. I checked something in here. All right, so I think it's a pretty good thing. I think it's too idealistic, if I'm being real. The idea that you can somehow stop all wars ever from existing again, or that the world's ever going to accept a single political system completely is a little absurd. But I mean, there are worse goals to have. All right, now, identify what the US brings to the war. So we're going to kind of talk about how they go into this. The war is ending, but like they're still bringing things. The biggest thing is supplies. Okay, the US brought tons of food, tons of money, and fresh troops. The fresh troops are useful, but the money and food is much more useful. So in terms of supplies, they're bringing new everything. The second thing is the War Revenue Act. So look at 12. Explain the purpose of the War Revenue Act and identify its impact. In 1917, as we're entering the war, we passed the War Revenue Act. Knowing that it's extremely expensive, Wilson is trying to tax his way to paying for it. The War Revenue Act allowed Congress to tax its wealthiest Americans of 77% of their income. All right, increase on federal revenues during this time period because of this act went up 400% within 2 years. In 2 years, prices were 4 times more expensive than they had been previously. We're talking about a monumental tax movement. One that, yet again, you know, I've asked questions like this, and I'm asking it to my World War II kids, my regular US. You know, is national security more important than individual rights or freedom in a moment of crisis? And the vast majority of them are saying, yes, it is. National security is more important. To which I'm like, well, okay, you can think that, but look at what happens when you trust the government to look out for national security. They raise taxes to an insatiable level. And yeah, they back them off once they're done, but they don't back them off to what they were. And slowly but surely they make more money as a result because they're grabbing more inch by inch. It's always like that analogy about the toad. If you try to throw a frog or a toad into a boiling pot of water, it'll be burned, but it'll jump right out. Whereas if you put the frog or the toad in the water and slowly turn up the heat of the burner, minute by minute, it'll sit in there until it boils alive. Americans with taxes are a lot like the slow burning frog. All right, that takes us to the idea 12A, identify the purpose of Liberty bonds and explain the impact on the national debt. So Liberty bonds are actually really cool. Bonds are a way that the American people can actually give a loan to the government. So if I buy a Liberty bond, let's say I buy one at $50, the promise is pretty simple. I'm giving my direct $50 up front to the federal government. And it's on the promise that in a year or 2 years, I'll be able to cash in my bond, quote unquote, my paper, for not only the value that I gave it, the $50, but with a little bit of interest. So maybe that 50 becomes a 60. They're super safe bets. Owning Liberty, not just Liberty bonds, but just government bonds, is almost a guarantee of a return on investment. So like if I invested $100 in just a government bond right now, there's a good chance that in a year, it would actually be worth $108. And you're thinking, oh, in a year, you got 8% back. Okay, great, yeah. But think of it this way. 8% on $100 is nothing. But if you have hundreds of thousands of dollars to buy and you can get an 8% return, you're making money without having to do anything. And they're super safe, right? And as a result of this, the national debt balloons from 1.2 billion to 25 billion in just 3 years. The government's taking on a butt ton of debt through Liberty bonds. Now, I want you to explain the impact. In taking on that debt, they do get their hands on cash immediately. My $50 bond is immediately in their pocket to spend. So take a second, hit pause, and tell me, what is the impact on the national debt? Is it worth it, I guess? Is it good to raise the national debt if it means cash on hand during a war? Take a second, answer that for me. All right, so I don't know where you stand on the idea of upping the national debt in a time of crisis and war. But having cash on hand in a time of crisis and war is always a better alternative than not having it. So most economists are in favor of this because that money isn't just sitting in the pockets of the American government. It gets immediately poured into the federal economy. They're buying tanks, they're buying food supplies, they're buying weapons, they're paying people to go to work. These Liberty bonds give the American government enough money to basically engage the war machine and get the economy flowing. This is one of the biggest reasons why war economies are some of the best American economies we've ever experienced. I hate to say it this way, but most presidents probably don't want World War II to happen, but most presidents who are dealing with struggling economies have no problem whatsoever with the idea of a smaller skirmish or war popping up that they can begin to, create revenue with. All right, but that moves us on. That leads us to 12B, and identify the purpose of the War Industries Board and explain the impact on industrial production. Basically, they're just a bunch of, bureaucratic, pencil neck, white dudes at desks who regulated all the war materials. They get to decide how the money's spent, basically. And as a result, they increase the industrial production of the United States by 20%. I'm gonna go fast on these because they're really not that big of a deal. That leads us into C, the purpose of the Food Administration and the impact on food production. So the guy who ran it will actually become the future president, Herbert Hoover. And while he's running the FDA, the Food Administration, he wanted to increase food production and to conserve food. Think about how hard that is, actually, that you want to make more food, but also save more food. You're trying to get the American people to buy into conserving food so you can send more to the front line to help the boys. So in other words, you're tying basically fasting and dieting to patriotism. So they had to come up with a whole gang of slogans, right? The purpose behind this is to feed all of the soldiers on the front line, not just the Americans, but all of the Allied soldiers. So slogans like serve just enough, or, can you imagine, like, we got Taco Tuesdays right now. What about wheatless Mondays, no bread? Meatless Tuesdays, no tacos. Don't waste it. On the premise that the boys at the front deserve more of this. All right, and that leads us into D, explain the purpose of these posters. Look at this. This is amazing. The greatest crime in Christendom is to buy, to cook, and to eat more than you need. To waste a single morsel of food that can be used is a crime. Any of y'all have overbearing parents who are like, you'll clean your plate before you can get up from the table? Or grandparents, maybe, that are that way? Well, this has kind of been ingrained in them. Those people have lived through World War II, or were raised by people who lived through World War II. And the people who were raised during World War II were raised by World War I people. And this is just kind of the way it works. The Food Administration says eat less and waste nothing. I mean, it's a heck of a way to lose weight, I'll be real with you. And then, I like this one, buy it with thought, cook it with care, use less wheat and meat, buy local, and use what is left. Get a sense of the purpose behind this. It's trying to control the food in America. All right, the last two big ones. We're going to look at the idea of influencing public opinion. And, actually, this will be one that I do in class now that I'm looking at, because I want to read about the Sedition Act in class. So I'm actually going to cut it there because that gets us to the end of the war and the 14 points. Everything else that we do, we'll do in class together. So for me, relatively short narrated EQ. I hope that you stay swizzy, and I will catch you on the flippity flip.